Please treat me with dignity the same way I am treating you with dignity. Give me a chance to lead this institution according to the ideals that we stand for. Not to crucify me just because I come from some country. Some of you maybe feel like we are still colonized in the mind. No. No, we are not. No, we are not. So please, let's respect each other.
Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're going to jump right into the world of international diplomacy.
All right.
It's a world where things can get pretty complicated pretty quickly.
Yeah, stakes are high. Every move's analyzed. It's a fascinating area.
It is. And we're going to be looking at a situation today involving the Inter-Parliamentary Union.
The IPU.
Yeah, the IPU. And using a clip from a YouTube channel called Africa is powerful.
Okay.
Now, for those who maybe aren't familiar, the IPU, it's a global organization made up of parliaments from around the world.
Right. A big forum for dialogue, trying to get countries to work together.
Exactly. And as we'll see, that quest for diplomacy, well, it can get a little tricky.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
We're going to be looking at a moment where the current IPU president, Dr. Tulia Ackson of Tanzania, she's facing pushback from some delegates.
Okay.
Particularly Ukrainian and Western delegates. And it's all because of her decision to visit Russia during the ongoing war.
Yeah, that's a tough one right away. You can see how this is going to be controversial.
It is, and it puts a spotlight on that fine line that diplomats have to walk.
Absolutely. How do you stay neutral when you're dealing with a conflict like that? When does talking to one side start to look like you're taking their side?
Exactly. Those are some of the questions we'll be exploring today.
Looking forward to it.
All right, well, this clip that we're going to be looking at, it really captures that tension. And it's from a recent IPU assembly in Geneva.
Okay.
And Dr. Ackson, she's giving a report on her activities as president, but then things get a little heated.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, delegates start really grilling her about that trip to Russia.
Makes sense.
So picture you've got this room full of diplomats, all these global expectations, and then boom, Dr. Ackson's put on the spot to defend what she did.
Gotta be tough.
Let's hear that first excerpt where we really see this criticism surface, and we hear Dr. Ackson firing back.
All right, let's hear it.
I'll now give the opportunity to Ukraine. You have 2 minutes.
Finally. Madam President, I will try to be as short as possible because I value our time and time of all our colleagues. You reported that you met with Putin. I want all of us to know that it happened just a few days after Russian missile destroyed the famous children's hospital Ohmad in Kiev. Just a few days. And because of that, I have a few simple questions to Madam President. Really questions. And I and many of my colleagues, not only from 12 plus, but all around this assembly, also want to get the answers. First question. When the members of Governing Council will receive the full protocol of your meeting with Putin? Second question, did you discuss with him the IPU resolutions about Russian aggression to Ukraine? Third question, did you raise during this meeting the topic of kidnapped Ukrainian children? And last but not least, why you, Madam President, not answering the written requests from delegations to you, but even not only from delegations, but also from the geopolitical groups? I mean, written requests about information. We already sent them and we didn't receive any answer. You know, we should understand that such meetings, they are just prolonging the war, but not stopping it. And because of that, such meetings, they continue suffering of the people, not only in Ukraine, but in particular, for example, in African countries, when people become really suffer because of the food crisis caused by Russian unprovoked aggression to Ukraine. So I will kindly ask you to answer my 4 very simple questions. Thank you very much.
The president of IPU has all of a sudden become a monster. Please treat me with dignity the same way I am treating you with dignity. I will at all times advance parliamentary diplomacy. I will at all times give respect to the ideals of IPU, but I request you members to also accept I'm not God, I'm not an angel, I'm only human, I'm doing what is possible within my powers. The president of the task force has just informed you, and I have been repeating myself in this respect. I was requested by the task force to do what I did. What did I do wrong? I was supposed to sit back and tie my hands and say there's nothing we can do as IPU. That will not be doing justice to the women and children of Ukraine who are suffering. That wouldn't be fair to the mandate that you have given me. Give me a chance to lead this institution according to the ideals that we stand for. Not to crucify me just because I come from some country. Some of you maybe feel like we are still colonized in the mind. No. No, we are not. No, we are not. So please, let's respect each other. I'm doing the best that I can, and that is exactly what I'll do. That is my commitment to you. I will keep doing that. Thank you very much.
Wow. You can just feel the tension in that room, right?
Oh, yeah, she did not hold back at all.
She didn't. And the way she uses those rhetorical questions, like she's turning it right back on the people criticizing her.
Uh-huh.
And that direct address, like you didn't ask me.
It's a bold move.
It is a bold move. What do you make of that communication style?
Well, I think it shows that she's feeling attacked. She feels like she's being unfairly singled out.
Yeah.
And this is her way of fighting back. She wants to control the narrative. She's saying, hey, I'm not here to be lectured. I have my own perspective, and I'm going to make sure you hear it.
Yeah, she's not letting anyone talk over her.
Nope, she's standing her ground.
Okay, well, she's not letting up. And in this next excerpt, a delegate from Iraq, he jumps in and he throws a curveball.
Okay, this should be interesting.
Yeah, he criticizes Dr. Ackson for visiting Russia, but not going to Gaza.
Comparing the two situations.
He is, let's listen.
All right.
Go ahead, please. Iraq, go ahead.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you, Madam President. Greetings to everyone present here today who came from all over the world, except for one country, a state that has been killing and committing murders and atrocities against civilians, women and children, and undermining all forms of life in Gaza and nowadays in Lebanon. This extremist government will extend its atrocities all over the Middle East. Madam President, in your report you mentioned that you have visited some of the hotspots of the world, and this is one of the priorities of the IPU. You mentioned that you visited Russia. But in reality, I think that it would have been better to visit Gaza out of all places in the world. The Zionist state has prevented the UN Secretary General a year ago to go to Gaza and to see the atrocities and the destruction and the genocide that took place there and the displacement. So I call upon all delegations present here today to pay attention to what's happening in the north of Gaza and in Jabalia. People are being starved to death. For more than 2 weeks now, medication, food, water, electricity are being prevented from entering in order to displace the people living there who have been surviving for more than 1 year in the face of the killing and the mass murders and displacement. Until when will the world remain silent and blind? Until when will we remain silent in the face of the calls for help of the women and children of Gaza while they are being bombed with the most horrendous weapons? Until when will the Western countries and the United States in particular continue to support these atrocities and horrendous crimes? Until when will we remain silent in the face of the blatant violations of international laws and the rulings of the ICJ and the ICC? Until when will this rogue state will remain above the law, above international law and above humanity? They are spreading publications here about a number of hostages or people that are being detained by the resistance, and they completely forget the remains of children and women that remain under the rubbles. Madam President, I call upon you as representative of the parliaments of the world to visit Gaza and the south of Lebanon, and I hope that we will stand in the face of this international terrorism. Thank you.
So he really shifted that whole conversation, didn't he?
He did. It brings a whole other layer of complexity to it.
Yeah. Do you think it's a fair comparison?
Well, it's tough to say. I mean, obviously these situations are both really complex in different ways.
Right.
But I think he's definitely trying to make a point about consistency, you know? Like, if you're going to engage in dialogue during a conflict, why one and not the other?
Makes you think about what factors determine which conflicts get attention on that global stage, right?
For sure, it's about perceived bias, who gets prioritized, whose voices are heard. It's a big question.
It's a huge question. So how does Dr. Ackson respond to that challenge? Let's find out.
Okay, let's see what she said.
Colleagues, a concern was raised by Iraq in respect of the report that I've just given you, and Iraq was questioning, why did I visit Russia in the context of the war in Ukraine and not Gaza? I would like to inform my colleague that you might note that in November last year, I visited Palestine and I visited Israel and I met the leaders. And that was my first visit after becoming president in October. So it's not like I have ignored what is happening in the Middle East, what is happening in Lebanon, what is happening in Gaza, and what happened in Israel. So I treat all the conflicts the same way. And you might also want to note the conflicts that we are talking about in the Middle East, the war that we are talking about in Ukraine, they are not the only conflicts that IPU is looking at. We are concerned about what is happening in Yemen. We are concerned about what is happening in Syria. We are concerned about what is happening in Sudan. We are concerned about what is happening in West Africa. We are concerned about what is happening in DRC. Lithuania asked specific questions. Who mandated you to visit Russia? Why not Ukraine first? The letters were sent out, dear colleagues. The letters were sent very explicitly. They explained, and if you need copies of those letters because they are not secrets, you can always have copies. Letters were sent to our counterparts in Ukraine. Letters were sent to our counterparts in Russia. My visit was to begin with Ukraine. Ukraine responded the dates that we were ready to visit them. Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Speaker would be in New York for the NATO meeting. Would I have stopped them? No. It would be wise. In any case, I don't have such powers. Now, because the meeting of BRICS was taking place, would I stop going to Russia because Ukraine is not ready to receive me because of time? No. Why? Because IPU stands for dialogue. IPU is talking about parliamentary diplomacy. And it is in that context that I did all that I did. And I thought I would be given a little credit for all the efforts that I've done, not to be crucified for things that I have not. You're asking here who mandated me, who mandated the former president who came from the 12 plus to visit Kiev, who mandated him? Please, I think we have to reach a point where I have explained myself several times to you 12 plus, to everybody else who cared to understand. If you have a feeling like I went to Russia without going to Ukraine first, I have told you several times, letters were sent out. I wouldn't turn out my visit to Russia because I'm unable to reach Ukraine. You didn't ask me similar questions when I visited Israel, did you? You didn't ask me similar questions when I visited Palestine, did you? You're not going to ask me similar questions when I visit Sudan. You're not going to ask me similar questions when I visit other places. I think, colleagues, let's have trust. You have elected a president who is supposed to deliver to her mandate. You have elected a president who is supposed to deliver to her mandate. And I think you are dealing with me unjustifiably, which is not fair to anybody. The questions that you have been raising, I have responded them to the best of my knowledge and to the best of my objectivity in all this matter. And you must know, I would not have asked to meet Mr. Putin if it wasn't for Ukraine. My commitment to doing that, and this is not the first place I'm visiting. Why is it that it's looking like I have met this person and therefore the president of IPU has all of a sudden become a monster? Please treat me with dignity the same way I am treating you with dignity. I will at all times advance parliamentary diplomacy. I will at all times give respect to the ideals of IPU, but I request you members to also accept I'm not God, I'm not an angel, I'm only human, I'm doing what is possible within my powers. The president of the task force has just informed you, and I have been repeating myself in this respect. I was requested by the task force to do what I did. What did I do wrong? I was supposed to sit back and tie my hands and say there's nothing we can do as IPU. That will not be doing justice to the women and children of Ukraine who are suffering. That wouldn't be fair to the mandate that you have given me. Give me a chance to lead this institution according to the ideals that we stand for. Not to crucify me just because I come from some country. Some of you maybe feel like we are still colonized in the mind. No. No, we are not. No, we are not. So please, let's respect each other. I'm doing the best that I can, and that is exactly what I'll do. That is my commitment to you. I will keep doing that. Thank you very much.
All right, so she's laying out her defense, right? Explaining when the visits happened, emphasizing dialogue as a key principle for the IPU. She also mentions that she sent letters to both Ukraine and Russia.
Right, trying to show that she's engaging with both sides.
Yeah, and she keeps repeating that point about the letters. Why do you think that is?
I think it's strategic. She's trying to counter that accusation of bias, you know? Like, look, I reached out to both sides. I'm not taking sides. I'm just trying to facilitate communication like it's my job.
Right, and it also shows how tricky scheduling can be in these situations.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, trying to get these high-level meetings to happen, considering all the different priorities and sensitivities.
Yeah. It's not as easy as just booking a flight.
Not at all. It's a delicate dance.
It is, and you can tell that this whole situation, it's really tense. Dr. Ackson is definitely feeling the pressure.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Now listen to this next part where she ends her response with a kind of personal appeal.
Okay.
Wow, treat me with dignity. I'm not God, I'm only human. That's powerful.
It is. It's a very human moment. You don't often see that kind of vulnerability in these settings.
You don't. What kind of impact do you think those words have on the audience?
Well, it's an interesting tactic, right?
Yeah.
She's appealing to their emotions, trying to get them to see her as a person, not just a political figure. It's like, hey, I'm doing my best in a difficult situation. I deserve some respect.
It humanizes her.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, how effective are those kinds of appeals? You know, do they actually change people's minds, or are they just overshadowed by the political realities?
It's definitely something to think about. But before we get too deep into that, let's hear that final part of this clip where Dr. Ackson answers some specific questions, and she talks about her commitment to getting those Ukrainian children back from Russia.
Okay.
She covered a lot there, addressing those specific concerns, clarifying the timeline, reiterating the IPU's goals. It seems like she's really trying to regain control of the narrative.
Yeah, classic diplomatic strategy, right? She's trying to show that she's accountable, transparent, all while navigating this incredibly sensitive situation.
It's a tough balancing act.
It is. You can tell she's walking a tightrope trying to appease her critics without backing down from what she did.
And she brings up that really important point about the Ukrainian children.
Right. And that reminds us why this all matters so much.
Exactly.
It's not just about politics, it's about people's lives.
This is all so fascinating, and we've only just scratched the surface. Stick with us as we continue to unpack this situation and explore the complexities of diplomacy in our world today.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, so we're back and ready to dig a little deeper into this whole diplomatic balancing act that we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, isn't it?
It is. And I think what Dr. Ackson's going through, it really exposes some of the challenges that the IPU is facing.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a microcosm of all the tension and division we're seeing on the global stage right now.
Exactly. So on the one hand, you've got people saying, we need to keep talking. Dialogue is essential, even with countries that are involved in conflict.
Right. The idea being that communication channels have to stay open no matter what.
But then on the other side, you've got people saying, hold on, engaging with certain actors, especially during a war, could make it look like you're supporting them.
Yeah, you risk legitimizing their actions, even if that's not your intention.
So it's tough, right? Where do you draw that line? When does talking become condoning?
And how do you weigh the potential benefits of dialogue against the risk of appearing to side with one party over another?
Exactly. There's so many factors to consider.
It's a real dilemma, and there's no easy answer. It depends on the specific situation, the actors involved, the potential consequences.
Really nuance.
So much nuance.
So let's zoom out a bit and think about the bigger picture. What does this whole situation with Dr. Ackson tell us about diplomacy today, particularly when we have a conflict like the war in Ukraine that has so deeply divided the global community?
Well, I think it highlights just how challenging it is to navigate this polarized world where trust is in short supply.
Especially trust.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, can any diplomatic action truly be seen as neutral in this kind of environment?
That's a good question. And, it makes me think, is there a double standard at play here?
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, Dr. Ackson mentioned that the previous IPU president, who was from a Western country, visited Kyiv and didn't seem to face the same level of scrutiny.
That's a valid point.
So is the reaction to Dr. Ackson's visit influenced by something else? Yeah.
Right. Like, are there underlying biases or geopolitical alliances that are shaping how people are reacting?
Exactly. Are certain actors held to different standards based on where they're from, their political leanings, their perceived allegiances?
It's something we have to consider. Those biases can be really insidious.
They can be. So what we're seeing play out with Dr. Ackson, it's like a real-time case study in the complexities of 21st century diplomacy.
Absolutely. And it raises a critical question. What impact could this controversy have on the IPU as an organization? Could it actually damage their ability to be a platform for dialogue and cooperation?
Could it undermine their credibility?
It's definitely a risk if those perceptions of bias take hold. It could be hard to regain trust.
And countries might start to align more strongly along geopolitical lines instead of working together towards common goals.
Exactly. It's like the very foundation of the organization, that belief in the power of dialogue. It's being tested.
So where do we go from here? Are organizations like the IPU even relevant in a world where trust seems to be eroding and power dynamics are shifting so rapidly?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Adapting to this new landscape while staying true to those core principles of diplomacy. I think organizations like the IPU are more crucial now than ever.
How so?
Well, because the world needs spaces where dialogue can happen, where bridges can be built.
Right.
Even if it's messy, even if it's uncomfortable.
Because without those spaces, things could get a lot worse, right?
Exactly. Escalating tensions, missed opportunities for understanding a world that feels increasingly divided.
Nobody wants that. So how do you think the IPU can move forward from this?
Well, I think the key is to demonstrate a genuine commitment to fairness and impartiality.
Okay.
They need to address those concerns about bias head on, be transparent in their decision-making, create clear guidelines for engagement, especially in sensitive situations like this one.
It's about rebuilding that trust, proving that dialogue can actually work.
Exactly. And it's not just about institutions, it's also about individuals.
Right.
Earlier we were talking about Dr. Ackson's emotional appeal, that moment where she said, "Treat me with dignity. I'm not God, I'm only human." You mentioned how that could be seen as deflecting criticism. Can we unpack that a little more?
Yes, definitely. It's an interesting point. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, using emotion in diplomacy, it's a fascinating tactic. It's an attempt to shift the focus from the political to the personal, to create empathy, to make people understand where you're coming from.
I can see how that could be effective when you're under so much pressure.
Right. It humanizes you. It makes it harder for people to just see you as the enemy.
Yeah.
But the tricky part is it can also be seen as a way to avoid addressing the actual concerns being raised.
Right, like judge me on my intentions, not my actions.
Exactly. And that's where the line gets blurry. Because intentions are important, but so are the consequences of actions and how those actions are perceived. That's the delicate balance that diplomats have to strike.
That they have to strike. So thinking about the bigger picture here, Are there any lessons we can learn from this situation that might apply to other organizations or even just to conflict resolution in general?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest takeaways is the importance of having clear protocols and communication strategies in place beforehand.
So being prepared, basically.
Exactly. Having guidelines for how to handle these sensitive situations could help prevent misunderstandings and accusations of bias down the line.
Yeah, it's like setting the ground rules so everyone knows what to expect.
Right, and making sure that any decisions or actions are communicated clearly and justified to everyone involved.
Transparency is key.
Absolutely. It builds trust and accountability.
What else comes to mind?
I think another important point is the need to be really aware of potential double standards in international diplomacy.
Right, we touched on that earlier.
We did, and it's
Yeah.
something we have to keep talking about. Are certain actors held to different standards because of their political alliances or their perceived power?
It's an uncomfortable question.
It is, but we have to be willing to ask those questions if we want to create a fairer and more effective global system.
Because ultimately, we want organizations like the IPU to succeed, right? If we want dialogue and diplomacy to work, we need to make sure everyone feels heard, respected, treated fairly, regardless of their background or their beliefs.
I completely agree. It's about creating a level playing field where everyone has a voice.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to go back to something Dr. Ackson emphasized, the issue of those Ukrainian children taken to Russia.
Right. A really heartbreaking situation.
It is, and she stressed that this is a top priority for the IPU and that they're working to get those children back home.
And that brings us back to the heart of why this all matters.
Why diplomacy matters.
Exactly. Beyond the politics, beyond the strategies, there are real human lives at stake.
Oh, you can't forget that.
We can't. And those lives deserve our attention, our compassion, our commitment to finding solutions that prioritize peace, justice, and human dignity.
Beautifully said, and that's a perfect note to end on for now. But don't go anywhere. We'll be back in just a moment to wrap up this deep dive into the complexities of diplomacy and the future of the IPU. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive. You know, it's been quite a journey, hasn't it, exploring all these nuances of diplomacy in the IPU. And
It really has a lot to unpack.
so before we let our listeners go off and ponder all of this, let's try to distill some key takeaways. What really stood out to you from our conversation?
Well, I think the most striking thing for me is how this whole situation with Dr. Ackson really highlights that tension between dialogue and neutrality.
Right. Can you really have a meaningful conversation with one side of a conflict without appearing to take that side?
Exactly. It's such a tricky balance, and there are no easy answers.
No, there aren't. It makes you question those limits of neutrality. You know, in a world that's so polarized, is it even possible to stay truly neutral when you're engaging with people involved in a conflict?
Right. Or are you always going to be seen as implicitly supporting one side over the other just by virtue of who you're talking to?
And as we've been discussing, that perception of bias, it can be so damaging.
It really can. It erodes trust. It undermines credibility. And ultimately, it just makes it that much harder to achieve anything through diplomacy.
In Dr. Ackson's situation, it really brings all those challenges to the forefront, doesn't it? Especially given her position as the leader of an organization that's supposed to represent such a diverse range of viewpoints.
Absolutely. And I think it underscores the importance of transparency and clear communication within these international organizations. You know, if the IPU had established those clear protocols for diplomatic engagement from the start, perhaps some of this controversy could have been avoided.
Right. Having those ground rules in place so everyone knows what to expect and how things work.
Exactly. It's about setting expectations, ensuring accountability, minimizing those misunderstandings.
And speaking of accountability, another key takeaway for me is that issue of perceived double standards. You know,
Yes, we touched on that earlier.
Yeah, we did. And it's something we can't shy away from. Are certain actors held to different standards simply because of their geopolitical alliances or their perceived power?
Those are tough questions to grapple with, but if we want to build a truly just and equitable global system, we have to be willing to confront them.
Because if we don't, we're just perpetuating a system that's inherently unfair and that ultimately undermines the whole idea of diplomacy.
And I think it's important to remember that these aren't just abstract concepts we're talking about.
Right.
These actions, they have real-world consequences for real people.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Dr. Ackson's focus on those Ukrainian children taken to Russia.
A stark reminder of the human cost of conflict.
It is. So as we leave our listeners with all these insights, I want to pose one final question for them to consider.
Okay.
Thinking about everything we've discussed today, where do you stand? Do you think Dr. Ackson was unfairly targeted? Or do you have concerns about her decision to visit Russia? What does this whole situation tell us about the challenges of diplomacy in today's world?
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, and I think this case study really highlights the fact that diplomacy is a balancing act. It requires a nuanced understanding of context, principles, and consequences.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping a world where dialogue is valued, where trust is fostered, and where peace and understanding are the ultimate goals.
Well said. And perhaps the biggest question we're left with is this. If dialogue is truly the path forward, how do we achieve it when trust is so fragile and perceptions of bias run so deep?
A lot to think about, for sure. Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the intricate world of international diplomacy. We'll see you next time.